my name is Hollis. Welcome to my channel, Watercolor with me. Today we're going to be going over kind of paint control and controlling water and your pigment on the paper. So I'm going to be mostly using a little bit of this ultramarine blue and this really nice and bright orange. It's called Permanent Scarlet. We're just going to jump right in. So depending on how you paint, if you are working from tube versus working from a pan, that is going to make a difference in how your paint reacts to your brush. Pan pigments tend to have been dried out for a very long time, so it takes a little bit of extra time to rehydrate them and reactivate them when you're painting. So to get started with those, I'm actually just going to go ahead and put a little drop of water in them. And this is not the exact same orange I'm using over here, and neither is this one, but they're very close, so I'm going to go ahead with these. I'm not quite sure what these colors are called. This is an ultramarine blue from Winsor Newton. This is an ultramarine blue from Turner's Watercolor paint. And we'll play around with both of those today a little bit. Get a sip of my coffee. Okay, so these have already been a little activated. These were dry from my previous painting session. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm mixing directly on my palette here, which is just a nice porcelain plate. The porcelain plate is really nice because it kind of lets you see the transparency of the paint through it and kind of gives you a little bit of a guide of how thick this paint is when it's going to go on the paper. And so I'm kind of fully loading my brush here. I'm moving it back and forth in the paint quite a bit in this little reservoir I have going on here. And I'm just going to go ahead and put that directly on the paper. So as I was pushing it back and forth, I'm seeing that it has a good amount of transparency to it. It's not incredibly dark, and that's letting me know I have a nice even medium tone here. Now alternatively, if I'm just working straight off the paint itself here and then go straight to the paper, it's going to be much darker, much more concentrated layer of pigment. And there's not a ton of water on my brush, which you can tell because it's kind of doing these spotty bits when I get to the end there. So same thing here with the orange, going back and forth on here. It's allowing me to do that. It's going to be a little bit stronger, more vibrant than the blue just because of the nature of this pigment. And then same thing, going straight off of the paint itself, straight onto the paper. And then depending on how much water you already have on your brush versus how much pigment, how wet the pigment is, that's going to make a difference too. So I tend to just like gently pull towards my paint to get it reactivated and just kind of create a little reservoir to know how much paint I need. So back to this little palette over here. So I'm going to go in with the ultramarine blue, and I'm just going straight into the palette box itself. And so nice and thick, very different shade of blue comparatively, and that's just kind of what happens with this one. Different brands have slightly different shades of blue. I wonder if I reloaded this with a different blue and I just thought it was ultramarine. Who knows? It happens. But just kind of straight out of the pan, you can kind of already see that it's acting a little differently. Different paint. And then same with the orange, straight out of the pan. I have to work it a little bit more in here to get it on the brush. Nice and thick, but it's not quite as solid and vibrant as the ones above. And with this, you can either, depending on how much you've used of your pigment, you can either create a color well in here by just adding a lot of water. The risk of that is that you end up oversaturating your paints quite a bit, and then you have to wait a really long time to let them dry out. So I'll usually use these little reservoir wells here. I'm just gonna grab a paper towel and clean these guys out a little bit, so that way I don't get as much color transfer. So with that, what I'm doing is kind of a similar idea of what I'm doing over here on this palette, where I am pulling the paint out of the pan here and depositing it in here. So I have a nice thick amount of paint here. I can tell because if I move it around, you're only getting a tiny bit of the white coming through. You can see that there. So if I add a little more water to this, just dipping my brush in, adding a drop or two at a time, and now I'm mixing it around, you can see that already you're seeing a lot more of the palette underneath. And so that's gonna give me a lot more of a translucent color. And I'll do the same thing here with this blue as well. And it's a similar idea of what you're doing over here. It's just you have to pull it away from the color a little bit more to get the similar effect. And then with more water, just like that. And so what do you do if, say, you're painting and you're like, oh no, that is way wetter than I wanted it to be, but I still really like that color amount? What I usually do is I will load up my brush and I will kind of pull it along the edge of my palette, or if I have a wall thing here, I'll slide it along that, and that way I get a similar shade, but it's not as heavily concentrated. And I can pull up excess water too with a drier brush. Because once this dries, although it appeared to be darker on the paper, it's going to dry the same level of big pigmentation. It's just dispersed in more water, but this way this dries a little faster. So that's one way you can make sure you're not getting too much. Another thing you can do is if you have a vat of premixed, you just make sure your brush is really dry by kind of pulling it along the edge of your water vessel. I don't know if you can see that. So I have just a jar here that I'm using for my water. And what I'll do is I'll pull the extra water out of the brush just by running along the edge here. And then I'll go in. And it adds a tiny bit of water to the pigment, but it doesn't add a ton. And then I can go back in here and get a similar effect. And you can also just reload your brush with the same pigment over and over again when you have it kind of pre-mixed like this. Okay. And having good control of this is helpful if you are wanting to do kind of layers of paint on top of each other, which is called glazing. So I have these guys over here. These are all nice and dry. This one's still a little bit wet here, but these top two and this one are dry. So I'm going to go ahead and just, with a little bit of pigment on here. There we go. That's what I wanted. I'm just going to go ahead and just do a line over here. So when you're glazing or layering your paint, the idea is that you are not trying to disturb the color underneath it and resaturate it. So you want a good amount of pigment on your brush, but you don't want it to be super watery, because that water is going to reactivate your paint on the paper. So if I were to do this line here with that, this is going to react a little bit differently now than this stripe here would, just because there is so much more water on it. And you're not going to get that nice clean layering effect that you can use to help create depth and a light or shadow and change the hue of the color a little bit. So kind of on the same side over here, do that. I'm just going to go crossway this way. And you can kind of see how the colors change even though they're the same two pigments on top of each other, just flipped. That's a good way to kind of test out your colors and see how they react with each other. If they're going to be a nice flat glaze, some colors might settle into each other a little bit even though they are completely dry and you're doing the glazing effect. Some of them might not. I'll do the same over here with these guys. So nice orange swatchy over there. I'll use the same with the blue. You can kind of see that was starting to pick up some of that pigment on that last pass because it's a little bit more on the orange side when I'm putting it down. That's okay. This is just a practice. It's a study. It's all about learning how to use the paint differently. Another thing you can do to practice your control of the paint is kind of do what I call, well, a lot of people call it, it's charging and pulling is what it's called. So you can kind of see how much water you need in your brush to either have a circle of paint or a swatch of paint kind of flow into the other paint circle. So with these guys, I got some orange, I got some blue. I'm going to make these circles. I'm going to initially make it just really close to the other one. And I'm just going to ever so slightly kind of let it overlap. And so these two are mostly even in their amount of wetness, so they're not quite bleeding into each other at all. But if I add some more onto the orange side, you can see that it's starting to kind of flow in there, and I can kind of guide it ever so gently just by kind of pushing it in that direction. And if I want to kind of stop it from doing that, I'm going in with a much drier brush now, and I'm just kind of pulling that pigment out of the circle. We can do this the other way as well. So I'm going to do, this guy's very wet on this side. Try to do one that's nice and wet on this side as well. A little bit of a darker blue. That's pulling it the other way now, but this one did a little bit more reactively because they were a little bit different amount of wetness. You'll notice that when you do this, there will be some paints that will always charge harder into the other one comparatively. But it's kind of that same idea as like the thirsty brush, where the water wants to go and flow into whatever's drier most of the time. Every now and then I do this and it doesn't work, but now this blue is flowing into the orange. And you can kind of play around with it and push it more if you want by tipping your paper. And you can create some fun little effects that way too. This is really fun for my painting fruit, just creating different color patterns, things like that. You can always add a third color into the mix and kind of see how it reacts. These guys are very wet, so they just want to really go into each other. Do a little bit of green here, a little bit of orange here. That one I just kind of really overlapped it, but that's okay. And then here as well. And sometimes it'll charge really hard, and sometimes it'll just be nice and subtle, and you'll see how it looks when it's all dry, and you might really like it or you might not. But this is a really good way of kind of learning to control the paint and controlling the color, and in kind of getting an understanding of how to let the paint kind of do its own thing with the charging and this kind of stuff versus doing the glazing where it's a little bit more of a controlled process. And there's nothing wrong with either. This is a really fun one if you're doing more illustrative work. Glazing is really popular in illustrative work as well because you're just kind of filling in. It's almost like using, almost like more of like a marker or a pen or a crayon or a colored pencil, where you're just kind of using it more as like a coloring technique. But you can also use it to create more depth. My last video where I was working on this guy here, I was using a lot of this glazing technique over areas to make sure I was adding more of that depth and adding more of that color variation and adding some shadow and things. And then something similar to the charging is what I was doing here to create the shadows underneath this building here. So there's a lot of different ways to make it go about. I'm going to go ahead and add some green over these as well, so you can kind of just see how that affects and looks different compared to our other colors. And this is a sap green. It's also from Turner's Paints. Just a brand that I found one time and I really like. Comes in a tube. Has some good color variation. I think it is made in Japan, but I'm not sure 100% on that, but I really like it. I feel like it has some really nice vibrant colors, really easy to use, really easy to mix compared to some of the other tube paints that I've tried in the past. So, but there's lots of different types out there. We'll go over some other things in some different videos in the future. If you have ideas for what you want to see next, let me know in the comments below. Again, thanks so much for watching. Have a wonderful day and happy painting. Bye.